Good afternoon, everyone. So, multipolarity. My piece is going to be about the emerging power of the street and public protests as influential political actors. Now, of course, the phenomenon of mass protests and mass political protests or for social and economic demands is by no means a new phenomenon. But what we've seen in the past few years, not just from the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings, but the protests here in Brazil, in Turkey, the anti-austerity protests in Europe, the Occupy movement in the United States, is, in my view, a new and changing phenomenon where it is not mobilizing the masses to put pressure on those that are in power, but it's actually contesting the monopoly of the political elite, the business elite, the military elite on the traditional institutions, the traditional processes of so-called democracy, where people are now being called upon once every few years to cast a single atomized vote and then are told, cast your vote and go home. They go home, they wait for 3 or 4 years until they are called again to cast the single atomized vote. The people are increasingly refusing this reductionist version of democracy. People are demanding better participation and are demanding a form of direct democracy that would actually allow them to hold those elected officials accountable and to remove them from power if they fail to really serve the interests and preserve the dignity and the just and equal treatment of those people that they purport to represent. Now, of course, most governments are threatened by this phenomenon. They like a more controlled political process where they can negotiate with particular elites and they can really manipulate the outcome most of the time, and where the electorate, those that actually sent those people and individuals and parties to power are, like I said, asked to wait until their turn comes in a few years to vote again. And that's why, at best, most governments in the world deal with this rise in mass protests as at best, an inconvenience, something that they have to grapple with, and a necessary evil. But at worst, of course, the result is usually brutal force. And we are seeing that type of force in the face of peaceful and mass protests around the world. As activists, it is our responsibility to counter this discourse that attempts to either vilify those that are acting outside these established, institutionalized, formalized avenues of power, or trivialize them as just, naive young people that are angry, that are good at saying what they don't like, but cannot articulate demands for what they do like. It's very easy for those in power, especially those that have the power, like I said, the political elites, business elites, military elites, and usually they work together. It's very easy for them to dismiss those that are, as the saying goes, voting with their feet. As activists, it is our obligation to document our experiences participating in these mass protests, but also counter this discourse. I do not personally, unfortunately, come from a community activism or community organizing background. My background was in research and policy work, but I still remember, and I am still inspired and transformed forever by that day when we stood on Tahrir Square in January of 2011, and suddenly we were looking around and there were hundreds of thousands of people just in Cairo, just in this place, that were chanting bread, freedom, human dignity. That for me was really a transformative moment. That's when I came to realize that the ultimate goal is not to convince those in power to reform themselves, and that governments generally don't have a tendency to self-reform, and that our role really was not, as sometimes we are led to believe, to represent the people, to give them voice, where we are either litigating on their behalf in courts, or are training them and raising their awareness, or researching them to write reports about them, or campaigning on their behalf. That idea for me came to an end in January of 2011, when I realized that really mobilizing public voices is the best way to deliver a message, and to force those in power to respond to these mobilized and collective demands, or to force them out of power in the face of these public demands. Governments don't like this, of course. They feel that it could get out of hand and it is difficult to control. So vilification, we mentioned, is one of the ways to deal with this. Manipulating the media is another way, is the vehicle, of course, to this effective vilification. We saw what happened in Turkey when, Taksim Square was completely filled with protesters that, in a protest that started as just opposing the destruction of a park in the central square of Turkey. But what happened is, in the face of these unprecedented mass protests in Turkey, almost none of the Turkish TV stations carried any news about it. One of the main stations was at the same time airing a documentary about penguins. Others were showing soap operas. And as a result, the protesters started to move their protest to actually in front of the main buildings of the main newspapers and TV stations in Turkey. Here in Brazil, there were also attacks on the press and some of the press vans that were there because of the way that they depicted the protests. In Egypt right now, where we have seen 3 months of unprecedented, the worst type of mass killings of protesters in Egypt's modern history, the media are all, public and private, cheering for the troops and praising the troops for what they did in the mass killings that reached on August 14th, as you know, over 1,000 protesters killed in one day. That is another challenge for us as activists, of course. I agree with Dima's presentation that the media are changing, but that we also need to come with our own new, as people in Turkey and in Egypt and different places had to come up with their own vehicles, their own media to really deliver their voices and their news. Another weapon that is used against us is the criminalization of protests, where either new laws are passed to make protests a crime, or existing laws, especially for anti-terrorism or public nuances or traffic laws even, are manipulated and retailored to criminalize abuse, to criminalize protest and to allow for abuse of the rights of protesters. Another weapon is to establish very high administrative and financial requirements for those that want to seek a permission. Even the licensing process of protests is often used by governments to make it impossible to obtain a permit or to really suck the oxygen out of a protest by asking for too early a permit or limiting the size of the protest or the distance that the protesters can have from the public institution that they are using. All of this is happening in Egypt and throughout the world. And then ultimately, if all of this fails, and sometimes without even exhausting these options, there is, of course, the brutal force. The use of either live ammunitions, a shoot-to-kill policy, a punitive use of lethal force against protesters to break the movement, not just break this particular protest, or the use of the so-called less lethal or non-lethal weapons, where purportedly the tear gas, pepper spray, taser guns are used to not kill, but often, as you know, from around the world, they are used to kill. And as you must be aware, the tear gas that was used in Istanbul and in the Turkish protests was manufactured and exported from Brazil and from the United States. And the company in the United States that was exporting the tear gas canisters to Egypt is the same company that's exporting the tear gas canisters from Pennsylvania to Israel, to Turkey, to Egypt, and elsewhere. That is another challenge that we have to face. But most importantly, we have to always emphasize that protests are beautiful. And that really they are a healthy democratic exercise. They are not a necessary evil. They are not an inconvenience and nuisance. They are essential for real democracy. You can't just send people to government through an electoral process and then forfeit your right to publicly associate with others and protest their misbehavior or failure to deliver their demands. And as human rights activists, the international legal framework, the international standards are not always readily available to help us in this fight. Usually governments and some legal practitioners would say that there is a right to peaceful assembly. And then, of course, use this very narrow framing to sometimes very easily either infiltrate protests through provocateurs that would get in a fight with a police officer and suddenly there is a small fight, or people would actually get in an actual fight and maybe throw a stone at a police van, as happens really in almost 100% of the world protests these days. But what governments do very cynically then, and sometimes with the support of the media, is to say, well, this is an unpeaceful protest. There is no protection, no human rights, because the protest is no longer peaceful. And this is a very important fight where we need to actually challenge the existing legal framework, even the international legal standards that say that the only rights to protesters are the rights to peaceful assembly. That has two negative impacts. One is that you can have an overwhelmingly peaceful protest where people that do not engage in violence at all are just lumped together with maybe a minority that does engage in violence, and then everyone is subject to the shoot-to-kill policy or the mass tear gassing or the collective punishment and dispersal of the protest. The second thing is that even those protesters that might throw a stone at a police officer, they continue to have the protection of other rights. All the legal rights are still there, and most importantly, of course, the right to life. But by allowing states to simply say this is non-peaceful, then there is punishment for all, and then there is a deprivation of all rights from those that might actually engage in violence. Those of us that actually participate in protest or observe protest, we know that 100% peaceful protest at the beginning, throughout the protest, and at the end is a myth. It's almost never existed. There is always, you can always count on a few protesters throwing stones or causing violence or having a shouting match or even exchanging a few punches with others. And it is very important for us to protect the right to protest from those that want to reduce the entire right into this minority of the use of violence. Another major challenge we're facing right now is the protection of women in public protests and protecting women's right to public protest, where in places like India, like Egypt, like Brazil, unfortunately, it is in many places very dangerous for women to exercise their public rights or to even exercise the right to be present in the public space. And one of the best ways to reduce the huge participation of women in public protests is the targeting of women through sexual violence as they participate in these political protests, through either just harassment and intimidation and creating a hostile environment for a woman to exercise her right to participate in a public gathering, to really the heartbreaking and extremely disturbing phenomenon of gang rapes and collective sexual assault on women as they participate in these public gatherings or as they even cover these public protests as media professionals. That is also another challenge we have to face. As human rights practitioners, we need to remember that we also have a role as investigators, as narrators, as people that are bearing witness to the abuses that take place there. Now, I come from a generation that did not really experience civil war, did not even experience foreign war. And my human rights training and experience before the uprising started in 2011 was limited to, gathering testimonies, writing reports, litigating in court, or conducting campaigns. And then suddenly you find yourself in a situation where there are hundreds of thousands around, where there are live ammunition and bodies falling around you, and the need to actually canvass the morgues and canvass hospitals, and you need to build your awareness about the different munitions that are used and the health impact of tear gas and other substance. You need to be able to challenge forensic reports of autopsies conducted on protesters that are sometimes manipulated by state forensic officers or by the ministries of health, of course, of the governments that are conducting these killings. And that is a completely new skill set that doesn't necessarily come to us as human rights practitioners. And one of the things we need to do right now as practitioners is to really train as war reporters, sometimes as correspondents that are covering war with all the challenges that come to the safety of our defenders that we send to observe and document what happens, but also to our ability to actually do a good job and be able to bear witness. But like I said, number one is to remember that our role as human rights activists is not to help those that fight, to help those that public protest. We are part of this movement. Regardless of whether or not we agree with the demands that are being raised by these protesters, we should see that it is the rights of everyone that are trampled upon when we allow a protester or a group of protesters that we disagree with to be killed or to be injured or to be vilified as terrorists or vandalists, etc. And that the protection that we seek for the right to protest is actually a self-defense, because that our turn is going to come, whether our turn as those that want to exercise these rights or as those that are victim to the abuses of these rights. Thank you very much.